Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. We welcome you to this edition of the Author Spotlight event of the West African Transitional Justice Center. We're privileged today to have join us Dr. Chris Davey from the Binghamton University in the United States, who will be speaking on his very important book, the Banyamulenge Soldier, which touches on very critical issues of our time, especially on the question of genocide as it touches on Congo and Rwanda. Um, you're welcome, Dr. Davey. We thank Mr. Frank Okyere for joining us, also of Binghamton University, of course, a practitioner with the Kofi Annan Institute for Peacekeeping in Ghana, who has also done a lot of research and also interventions in terms of mass atrocity crimes, Um, so we'll welcome you both. Just a brief introduction to the West African Transitional Justice Center before we start. This center has been designed for the research and practice of transitional justice in West Africa and across the continent. The focus is to try to bridge the gap, between these two fields so that the interventions that we make in the area of transitional justice and social justice in general are evidence-informed and sustainable. And so the Author Spotlight event is one of our flagship programs where we try to discuss very important literature in this field, and we bring authors to discuss their work and also open the floor up for discussion subsequently. Because we've taken a bit of time before starting, I wouldn't want to take more time, but I would like to hand over the platform to Dr. Davey to give us the key points in his book. Just to say that the link to the book has been earlier shared, but I'm going to share it again. So you can also follow up during the discussion. Dr. David, you have the platform.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. And I really appreciate the West African Transitional Justice Center hosting me to have this conversation today. I'm grateful for Frank as well being willing to talk more about the book with me in a bit. So the remarks I wanted to share today was to give you an insight on part of the book, and then I'll speak to some of the wider themes that are in it as well. And I wanted to kind of take this narrow approach, not only because of sort of the broader umbrella we're working under here under the theme of transitional justice, but also within the context of the quite wide-ranging impunity that the Rwandan government has been able to operate under in Eastern Congo. And so I wanted to speak to the part of my book that addresses this element particularly. And I thought, what better spot to do that in than here? So there we go. Of course, the talk is based on a chapter of the book and other segments that are relevant. And the book itself came together initially as a PhD project, and then with postdoctoral research that I conducted after I finished my PhD, and was published just a few months ago towards the end of 2025. What the book does is addresses the long-term involvement of the Banyamulenge and the Eastern Congo Tutsi community in various armed groups, and how their participation has developed what I call a genocide narrative identity. I show how the perpetrator, victim, and survivor identities for this group have become overlapped in a multi-directional set of conflicts and episodes of genocide in the region from the view of the soldiers from this particular ethnic group. And these episodes include, as sort of a headline, the Rwandan Civil War, the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, both Congo wars, and the continued M23 and Rwandan conflict in Eastern Congo today. Banyamulenge soldiers, and I suppose this is one of the reasons why my research focused on them, is because this core group of Congolese Tutsi fought alongside the Rwandan Patriotic Front across all of these events, all of these episodes. and currently are quite divided, and ever since the early 2000s have been quite divided in what kind of allegiance and allyship they have with Rwanda. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. One of the main armed groups representing this community is Turaneho, which in Kinyamulenge means let's defend ourselves. And I'll just say briefly, because I mentioned this group throughout the book, and I'll mention them a little bit today. Turaneho, prior to 2020, were a very sort of low-key armed self-defense group, quite dispersed throughout parts of the highlands of South Kivu in eastern Congo. But from 2020 onwards up to today, they became increasingly militarized by defecting Banyamulenge soldiers from the Congolese military. And now, and as of last year, are another key ally in the broader Congo River Alliance, which is the sort of political alliance that the M23 leads under the direction of Kigali and the Rwandan Patriotic Front and Rwanda Defense Forces and so on. So Turaneho started as this very small decentralized group, became militarized, and now are a very key ally and are fighting alongside M23 today and represent one particular division within the Banyamulenge community, which I'll speak to in a little bit. So I want to kind of get into a little story here to get us started. In early phases of my fieldwork in Bukavu in South Kivu, this is the main city in the province, I went with one of my soldier interlocutors, Rugira, as the pseudonym that I've given him in the book. And he took me to church, right? Something I was very used to doing as part of my fieldwork. And I actually quite enjoyed it because I got to sort of, from an ethnographic perspective, see a different side, but then also being Christian, I understood some of the symbology and the way in which religion and politics were being connected together. So Rugira took me to this church. The building was precariously embedded along this hillside going down into Lake Kivu. There were no windows, there were wooden benches, and a dusty floor. Of the Banyamulenge churches in the city, this was one of the lower income or working class ones. The preacher's sermon connected various experiences of violence, narrative, and memory. He paced up and down his platform, pointing out at the crowd with this very accusatory finger, and he spoke about how they, as Banyamulenge, found themselves tied to Rwanda's shaping of the past. He said the following: a proverb says, "To remember is killing." Our brothers keep remembering things I cannot talk about. They meet in their memorials, but they cannot talk about things that truly happened, as it is as if you are hanging yourself. So it is better to come and find a solution as brothers, or we will have a problem. They commemorate tomorrow, but do not prevent the whole situation from repeating. So in this preacher's view, the Rwandans, our brothers, right, had fatally bound themselves to the past through what he saw as hollow memorialization, memory without truth. As Tutsi, the Banyamulenge were captive and still are to this practice and its perpetuation of conflict. Rugira, the soldier who'd taken me there, seemed to instantly regret bringing me along to the service, privately censuring the preacher for speaking so recklessly. Yet the preacher's judgment was a salient one. Memory is a weapon that brings violence on the wielder, its allies, and the intended foe. For the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, this weapon shields their actions from and narratives from reproach. Just to give a little bit of a background, the phrase that I use in the book is an aegis of atrocity. So in Greek mythology, one of Zeus's gifts to his children was a shield of protection, or an aegis, and that was used in battles against their enemies. The aegis was arrayed with the head of a vanquished monster, and this representation of violence was carried before Zeus's chosen children as they went into war. The notion of terror is operationalized for the protective benefit of the possessor. Memory became a weapon. This is the weapon critiqued by the preacher. The RPF operationalizes the memory of terror in the 1994 genocide as a weapon to divert criticisms of their own violent labors, as well as a shield for battle, as they did in the 1990s and have continued to do so. It is imperative that the material reality represented by the aegis is accepted. The Rwandan genocide of mass proportions killed at least 500,000 Tutsi and a minority of Hutus. What has been done with this memory is what shapes the spaces between Rwanda and Congo today, especially for the Banyamulenge who inhabit this betweenness. So my talk today just briefly addresses this aegis, and within the wider context of my work on Banyamulenge soldiers, identify this genocide narrative identity where the stories that we tell about ourselves and our community have this very constructive and shaping power, but particularly in this case have become absorbed by a narrative of genocide. My discussion today about the aegis of atrocity fits within the wider genocide narrative identity for Banyamulenge and other self-identifying victim groups in the Congo and the broader Great Lakes region itself. A genocide narrative identity is a way of understanding how multiple exposures to genocide shape identities through the stories told about these experiences. So in the Rwandan military tradition, the military is known as Ingabo zu Rwanda, or the shield of the nation. It was believed by RPF leaders that this iteration of their iteration of this tradition would be an antidote to the military-administered genocide and the devastating legacy of colonialism back in the early 90s. The shield of the nation, in its increasingly rigid articulation of history, protected itself and the state it has absorbed. Enveloped in this militarized sovereignty is an RPF genocide narrative identity that does not include systematic nature of RPF violence at home and abroad. A crucial question deflected by this aegis is, how do we label and trace the violence of the RPF from the 1990s through to the present? The organized, targeted RPF violence against civilians during the Civil War and the genocide does not necessarily meet the classification of genocide, at least in my view and the view of others. But elsewhere in the book, I show how, through the experiences of Banyamulenge soldiers, these long-time RPF allies, the RPF movement towards genocidal destruction was realized by their targeting of Rwandan refugees in the First Congo War between 1996 and 1997. So, how does one affirm the genocide of 1994 while drawing attention to and understanding the violence of the RPF and its purpose? The aegis displaces examination of these questions, prohibiting a fuller analysis of the complex landscape of genocidal violence and thus truth and reconciliation in its aftermath. This question is especially pertinent when thinking about violence committed in the name of protecting Tutsi populations in Rwanda and across the Great Lakes region, especially today in Eastern Congo. More precisely, this is about how memory can perpetuate conflict through a genocide narrative identity. It is the case of the RPF and the Banyamulenge that memory is more often than not put into the service of justifying continual recourse to violence, particularly in Congo. Banyamulenge soldiers entered into their RPF's emerging world of violent identity making through the Civil War, the 1994 genocide, and post-genocide conflict and atrocities in Eastern Congo. Consequently, this narrative is now theirs as well. Yet any benefits of the aegis are largely limited to those beyond the security of Rwanda. Attempts by political actors in the Banyamulenge communities that I've worked with have been made to replicate the exceptionalism of this aegis. Genocide narrative identity therefore not only describes Banyamulenge soldiers, but also that of the RPF. Although the identities of these groups emerge in symbiosis together, they have become very strained over time. The aegis is always relied on as challenges to the RPF legacy arise, especially in the context of Congo. The Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights mapping report, released in 2010, attempts to document this violence as complex and multi-directional violence in Congo that is often hard to pass as a result of the Rwandan aegis. Let me explain that a little bit more. The report itself suggests that the displacement and killing of Rwanda, mostly Hutu refugees, by the RPF in 1996, 1997, so by the RPF and its Congolese, mostly Banyamulenge allies, could be considered a genocide. The pattern of violence lurking beneath the RPF's aegis has blocked investigations like this from following evidence through to a more thorough exploration, let alone leading to any form of regional transitional justice, which is sorely needed. The pressure to subdue the mapping report came swiftly following its release. First, Kigali threatened to withdraw peacekeepers from Darfur. An official response called for the rejection of what it labeled as a double genocide theory, which I'll be happy to speak about later. The Kigali response came as follows, right? It stated that to compare, quote, to compare the alleged deaths of at the most of several tens of thousands of all nationalities combined, during a decade of war to the murder of 1 million unarmed civilians in 100 days, only succeeds in trivializing the genocide of the Tutsi in 1994. Personal bias is exposed, and in this context, countless flaws in the draft mapping report cannot seriously be considered as purely unintentional. Close quote. So here, scale is positioned as a dominant feature of what would be a genocide, but the missing piece of the puzzle still persists. How do we classify the violence against intended identified threats in Congo during the 96-97 period? And how did the RPF violence in this decade evolve? Furthermore, what are the connections to anti-Tutsi violence and the violence that is waged in the name of fighting against the genocidaire or protecting Tutsi in the region? For Banyamulenge political actors and observers, the mapping report was similarly framed as a double standard by many, attempting to deploy their own version of the aegis to rebut it. Right? This double standard for many in the community is embodied by the genocide narrative identity characterization of Denis Mukwege. Mukwege, the Nobel Prize-winning gynecologist, often takes to social media to condemn endemic violence and join with many Congolese activists to call for the implementation of the mapping report's recommendations, as well as naming those complicit in the documented killings. In 2020, he spoke out against a massacre of civilians by Twirwaneho soldiers, again, Banyamulenge armed actors, increasingly militarized and organized at this point, as well again in 2021 through his Twitter account, following then reciprocal attacks on the Banyamulenge communities in that area. Mukwege said this, he said, there is an urgent need to ensure the protection of civilians in South Kivu. Clashes between armed groups must imperatively end. Transitional justice will establish a different scales of responsibility in the face of these crimes that plague our communities, close quote. Fifthly, the Mahoro Peace Association, which is a US-based Banyamulenge political diaspora organizing group, increasingly aligned with Rwanda and the Congo River Alliance, replied that these words from Mukwege were too little, too late, and accused Mukwege of denying genocide against the Banyamulenge that was ongoing at the time. While the Banyamulenge diaspora does not speak wholly for the community, particularly those based in the US, their views go a long way into shaping the international depiction of the conflict, particularly current conflict in South Kivu, as well as throughout the rest of the country. They also support the funding of armed groups like Twirwaneho. Augustine, another soldier who I spoke with, who's familiar with the mapping report, and as a result of various military intelligence roles that he held throughout his decades of experience, also connected Mukwege's feelings to a broader conspiracy. He said that the mapping report was a set of conspiratorial collaboration between public figures like Mukwege and others who oppose the Banyamulenge, saying that they went out and just fabricated these things, despite the fact that the mapping report establishing the clear attacks against Banyamulenge civilians in the mid-1990s. He went on to say that Mukwege is just like any other Congolese, like Justin Bitakwira, who are extremists, who hate us for nothing. All of it was a result of hatred for us. He claimed that genocidaires feeding the population with hate for their own personal gain were part of the authors of this report. In his eyes, a justified peace fought for with the blood of future generations of Banyamulenge were the only way to sort of erase the genocidaire threat against the Banyamulenge and other Tutsis in the region. So since the 1990s, the government in Kigali has enjoyed relative freedom to oscillate between overt and covert military involvement in Congo. Exceptions came around the international response to the M23 in its first iteration, 2013, where donor states, the US and the UK, calculated the support for the M23 had just gone too far. However, in recent years, Kigali is still using rebel groups to conduct proxy warfare and enforce its interests in Eastern Congo. Today, the M23, again under the Congo River political banner, holds significant territorial control under the protection of Kigali's aegis of atrocity. This enables continued extraction of minerals for Rwanda political elites, as well as, ironically, maintaining Kigali's reputation as a regional power broker. As in the prior iteration of pro-Tutsi rebellions, this continued war of aggression in Congo claims the protection of Tutsi groups like the Banyamulenge, but rarely translates into long-term security or peace. And I'd be happy to speak about that point later on because it's a really important point now. Dividends of the Aegis have not reached those who were the first fighters of the RPF, like the Banyamulenge. Fealty to the party in the state has successfully restricted these dividends. The unpopularity of the Rwandan President Paul Kagame among Banyamulenge soldiers I spoke to results from the RPF arming of Burundian rebels Red Tabara, who conduct violence against Banyamulenge in South Kivu, or at least up to the last couple of years. The RPF's this multi-directional violence limits Banyamulenge access to the Aegis, turning Kigali's shield often against its former brothers in arms. This tension bears out in other ways. The notion that the Aegis can be used to enable the RPF to fight its wars beyond its borders is well understood and increasingly declared by many Banyamulenge. Banyamulenge pop star, musician, in one of his music videos, and this is quite anecdotal, right, describes the meddling and oppression of the Banyamulenge by Kagame and his elite, quoting a high-ranking Rwandan officer in the music video, quote, "As we have already said, those military jobs will be fulfilled abroad because Rwanda is a small country and we cannot afford to let those bombs come over here. Over there, Congo, we have large countries. Our problems will be solved there. If you want us to start on Mount Kigali, it's like fighting in your own living room," close quote. And this quote was mobilized in the song to, again, articulate this criticism of Kigali. These tensions, however, do not diminish the apparent currency of applying the Aegis in their own context. Acceptance of RPF narratives around the genocide and their own violence, Banyamalenge's own violence that it experiences, often result in sort of subsuming their experience into or alongside the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda. The RPF is able to marshal a significant, or continues to marshal a significant amount of international aid and justice around its cause, ensuring that most of its foes are branded either as genocidaires or deniers. What is apparent is that while some Banyamulenge soldiers, political actors, and diaspora leaders have disavowed Kigali politically, the traces of connections to Rwanda and utilization of this Aegis are evident. Twirwaneho justifies continued violent conflict as self-defense against extermination. As part of the Congo River Alliance since last year, this dynamic has only sharpened. The genocidaire is yet to be defeated and is alive and well, yet, not necessarily in the ghosts of the democratic forces for the liberation of Rwanda, or FDLR, but in the perceived coalition of enemies from various Congolese Mai Mai groups, Burundian Red Tabara, and even the Wazalendo militias that have been organized by the Congolese military. In the relative safety, and I'll wrap up with my final comments here, I think soon. In the relative safety of Kenya, a refuge for many injured Banyamulenge soldiers, was often experienced Kigali as kind of a looming threat, even in this sort of quite distant place. And my research assistant in Nairobi recounted how in 2021, a Banyamulenge political activist who regularly spoke out against Rwandan influence in South Kivu, was and also a local supporter and Twirwaneho agent. This is prior to solidifying of the alliance last year. This activist was cornered in a bar by two assailants. Speaking Kinyarwanda, they ordered that the room be emptied and then shot the activist point blank in the head. Other locations in Nairobi were sites that we had to steer clear of as we engaged in our fieldwork there in 2022, as identified as listening posts occupied by Rwandan informants. While I was always confronted by the subjective reality of the world Banyamulenge actors inhabited, the fears for safety were potent and a driving force for security concerns of most of the soldiers that I spoke to. Those excluded or exiled from the Aegis, and it denied its protection. Another Aegis example is that in the killing of Ntwari Bukuru. And Ntwari Bukuru was a Banyamulenge lawyer, often speaking in public on news on the internet, very critical of Kigali's role in South Kivu and in destabilizing the Congo. He called out what he described as Rwanda's plot to exterminate his country, According to Bakura's family, he was forced into a car, and this is around 2022, 2023. He was forced into a car in Kigali, driven to a building in the business district, taken up to the fourth floor, and pushed off the edge of the building by an unknown assailant. The Rwandan Bureau of Investigation quickly responded to allegations, saying that there was no foul play and clearly evidence pointed towards suicide before even conducting an investigation. Bakura's death added momentum to the Banyamulenge narrative of a genocide narrative identity and the uses of Rwandans' aegis against them. The RPF is willing to protect its legacy and memory at all costs. Bakura's death itself seems to have been included in this cost and was foretold by the preacher that I witnessed in Bukavu a few years earlier. So, just to conclude, RPF violence and memory is about mobilization against the genocidaire. Increasingly, the aegis of atrocity enables ambitious political control across the region, particularly in Congo. Critical analysis has yet to go beyond the narrative enshrined and protected by RPF memory. This includes highlighting the violence that served as a refiner's fire, in turn structuring responses to threats coming from the crisis-ridden Eastern Congo. Polarized arguments made by ideologically driven researchers and commentators, including those praising the RPF, create an impasse for further research and debate. They miss both the important process of destructive connections across the RPF, with a long genealogy of Congolese allies, practices in Rwanda and Congo, and therefore unable to push analysis beyond prevalent articulations of genocide. The kind of atrocity making up the RPF's aegis turns out to be both that which they have enshrined in memory, as well as that threatened by the state against existential and unwinnable enemies, including its own citizens. Here, the specific RPF version of a genocide narrative identity manifests not only in its construction of history, but also in its development of the aegis itself. Banyamulenge soldiers make up a conflicted party of actors, finding themselves caught between experiences and articulations of genocide, being pressured into collaboration with Kigali, as many have and even have been subject to torture to fight with and for the M23. So notwithstanding that, right, they're increasingly seen by invaders in their own country. Disarming the aegis suggests deployment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, offering a retelling of Rwandan stories more inclusively. The trapped position of Banyamulenge soldiers and even those targeted in ongoing violence could, in the words of the preacher, be liberated by sisters and brothers coming together for a solution, not in the service of the RPF's elite extractive interests in Congo. So I'll pause there and pass it over to Frank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Davey, for your very detailed discussion of this topic. I think that focused on chapter 7 of your work, Ages of Atrocity, I think, yeah. And it's quite interesting. I'll just try to give a brief summary of what you discussed. I hope I am able to attempt that in a few seconds. So I think you started by trying to clarify the Tuaneho group, and how they were initially local. We call them vigilante here, armed group for self-defense, and increasingly became militarized, having been joined by the Banyamulenge soldiers, when they were integrated into them. Then you delved into the aspect of your experience during your ethnographic fieldwork, I suppose, in Eastern Congo, where you, of course, always reverted back to this homily, the sermon of the preacher, and how it tried to draw the connection between memory and truth, and how complex it is in managing what we remember if it is not appropriately processed. Of course, you always rather to attempt to remember is killing. Memory without truth will always breed violence. And so it's important that the way in which we remember is properly suited into the kinds of narratives that are objective in representing the past. And I keyed that into the fact that while you were discussing you mentioned the fact that the events of the past may not actually fit into the description of genocide or the conventional, definition of genocide, which in itself has been an ongoing discussion, especially as specific to different contexts. Is it enough for us to stick with this conventional definition, or do we need to revisit, based on the demands of the time? You also talked about the control of narratives, which I think this is very important, especially as it touches on questions of identity, questions of experience and exposure to violence, and questions of managing in Congo, at the moment. So I think it's important to also end with you on the fact that trying to manage the situation has to be a joint effort, between different stakeholders, in order to drive the path forward action. You are muted. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Before I start, let me use this opportunity to thank the West Africa Transitional Justice Center for creating this platform for exchange and also for us to be able to engage on important topics such as this one. I also like to thank Philip for being very persistent and always pushing the limits and bringing together, I think, very exceptional authors to discuss these important issues. And then finally, let me again congratulate Professor Chris Davey also for this very important book. And I'll say those who have been following happenings in the African Great Lakes region would admit that this book has come at a very crucial moment when the Eastern Congo is experiencing renewed crisis, dealing with the M23 occupation, which continues to expand, and then also an international community that continues to struggle to grapple with the multidimensional or multidirectional nature of the violence in the Great Lakes region. As a student of genocide and atrocity prevention studies, I see this book as the first critical genocide-focused study of Congo Banyamulenge Soldier identities. If you look at the Banyamulenge as an identity group, they often do not feature in the mainstream analysis of genocide. So I believe this is a really timely contribution to the scholarship on Banyamulenge soldier identities. If I were to attempt a summary of the core argument from the book, which will be very difficult, I must say, I would say that this book by Professor Davey on the Banyamulenge soldier genocide between Congo and Rwanda, it compels us to confront an uncomfortable truth. And that uncomfortable truth is that in the African Great Lakes region, conventional categories of victim and perpetrator are not only insufficient, but they also actively obstruct the pathway to peace and justice. And the book demonstrates why that matters. It does so through the voices of those who are caught in what Chris presents as a war without an end. I personally enjoy storytelling, and Chris creatively uses real stories to drive home some of his arguments. And so what I will do in the next few minutes is that I will attempt to distill some of the key ideas from the book, but I'll limit myself to just a couple of chapters that I personally find compelling, even though I must say that the entire book is truly compelling. So the first idea that I think the book introduces is that concept of genocide narrative identity. And here, instead of using this victim perpetrator narrative, Chris uses social actors as the concept to explain this genocide narrative identity. This is very important in the way he captures it as social actors instead of victims or perpetrators. And it is important because the stories we tell about ourselves indeed shape who we are, and we can easily see that reflect in how the Banyamulenges present themselves within this entire genocide narrative. And he uses the opening, which, if you read it, he starts with a compelling story. And one of those stories is one of Lieutenant Nicholas Kibinda. He was an RPF-trained Banyamulenge officer who was also killed under suspicious circumstances 2 years after the Rwandan genocide. And the book, I think, pivots from there because his death became the foundational sacrifice narrative, which continues to shape the entire Banyamulenge soldiers and how they also see themselves and their cause. And so that sets the tone for what I believe is a very complex and then also a layered victimhood and agency that is at the heart of this genocide narrative identity. There are many other compelling examples of this genocide narrative identity in the book. We also learn in the book of Ngabo and Ruggira in the introduction. And even though they have the same liberation narrative, when you follow their story produces divergent outcomes. So Ngabo, born in Uganda, he now lives safely in Rwanda, according to the book. But Ruggira, who is a Banyamulenge from South Kivu, he also fought alongside Ngabo in the same war, but now he remains trapped in South Kivu. And if you follow the history or the story of the Banyamulenge, you will know that they are considered foreigners in Eastern Congo. So as Chris puts it, the fight or this liberation narrative, it became a sort of imprisonment for Ngabo. So he is caught now between Congo and Rwanda. Now, so the key point I see as the theoretical foundation of the book is that Banyamulenge soldiers, they joined RPF in ending the genocide, the Rwandan genocide, I mean, but the same soldiers were also involved in killing Hutu refugees in Zaire 2 years later. And that, I think, Professor Davey also called it a hidden genocide in and of itself. And so these same soldiers are today targets of attacks in South Kivu. And I think it's the complexity that the book compels us to sit with. Banyamulenge soldiers simultaneously as victims, but they are also survivors. And in the same vein, they are also perpetrators. And so this is the idea that the book presents, that the neat categories of victim perpetrator narratives, it just oversimplifies the issue and doesn't do justice the circumstance of the Banyamulenge. For me, one of the most striking contributions of the book is the chapter 6, which talks about the heart of self-defense. And it is where Chris traces this intergenerational reproduction of the Banyamulenge soldier. It is where I see the practical manifestation of this genocide narrative identity. RPF-trained veterans are now training a new generation of fighters, which Chris, as he said, the self-defense group of Kewaniho. They use the same methods, they use the same narrative frameworks that they learned from the RPF earlier. But I think chapter 6, it also poses this very interesting question, which is called the hardest question in the book. And that question is that, to what extent is communal self-defense a moral response as well as a replicator of mass violence? And here the premise is that the Congolese state, it lacks the ability to protect the population. And that failure of the Congolese state, it produces these self-defense groups in the Twewaniho, which creates, I think, a feedback loop. And that feedback loop is what also confronts us, forces us to confront this whole idea of genocide narrative identity. First is that the state absence gives rise to legitimate armed self-defense. But armed self-defense also provokes further intercommunal hostility against the Banyamulenge, which then deepens the perception that the Banyamulenge faces an existential threat. And that threat reinforces this whole genocide narrative identity, which produces more soldiers. And so you see this feedback loop of state failure reproducing a complex layer of threat and then of self-defense narratives. And this is, I think, at the core argument that the book makes in this particular chapter. And Chris documents this loop in granular detail that I think is uncommon in the mainstream literature on Eastern Congo. But there is a major dilemma here, and Chris argues that militarization of this communal self-defense, it doesn't stop the genocide, at least not in the case of the Banyamulenge. And he demonstrates that through several examples in the book. One of it is the armed rebellion which led to this Gatumba massacre, if you read the book. One of the, I think, genocide sites in there. And yet, the question is, if one is facing an existential threat, then doing nothing is untenable for those on the ground. So the question that we have to ask is, how do we address this dilemma? If militarization of self-defense does not stop genocide, and one is facing an existential threat, how do you deal with this particular dilemma? And I sense Chris has already talked about the ages of atrocity. I will not belabor that particular which is the chapter 7, but there is a crucial link between chapter 6 and then also chapter 7, where he presents the ages concept. And what I would say here is that the Banyamulenge are excluded through this ages concept. They are excluded from the protection that they themselves helped to construct. They fought alongside or with the RPF and helped build this post-genocide state in Rwanda, but they are also subjects of attack sponsored by the same Rwandan government. And so these ages of atrocity, it presents a certain class of people, which are the RPF elites, but it doesn't really extend to the Banyamulenge. And I think this presents this very unique and complex role or place of the Banyamulenge within this whole genocide narrative. But it also reveals a troubling dynamic that as they are excluded from Rwanda's ages, other actors are also actively trying to construct their own version of this narrative. Without going further into other sections of the book, I think the book it produces several questions that I think perhaps if Chris has the time, he could also throw some more light on that. And the first is that since Chris, you developed this concept through a Banyamulenge case, I am wondering, to what extent do you see this genocide narrative operating in other conflict contexts? I think we are seeing several other multi-directional conflicts in the current dispensation, and I think one of which is Sudan, which is still playing out. So to what extent does this genocide narrative identity extend to other and then I think you also document recent cooperation between the Twirwaneho and the M23. And since the M23 continues to expand its occupation in Eastern DRC, the question I want to ask is whether this changed the nature of the self-defense claims when the Banyamulenge Soldier merges with the M23 movement under Rwanda's military command. And then finally, I think you are also very critical of this global North interventionism. And I'm wondering, what role do you think international actors should play in addressing the conditions that sustain the genocide narrative identity that you described? I think the book has several implications for genocide and mass atrocity prevention. First is that it raises the question of how prevention frameworks engage communities where self-defense is perceived as the only response. I think the mainstream literature doesn't really do justice to this question. And the second is that it also exposes the limitations of these analytical frameworks. One of them, which you cited, is the stages model of genocide by Genocide Watch, which you ignores this complexity of multidimensional conflict. I believe this book makes a very vital contribution to genocide studies, especially within the African Great Lake region scholarship. But how do we also think about issues of identity, memory, and violence? I think key issues that the book has creatively addressed through its pages. So I'll end it here, but thank you so much for giving us this very important book. And we are looking forward to more because I know you are still engaged in deep research in the Great Lakes region. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Osei, for your in-depth analysis of some very important concepts in the book. Just to say that from what you discussed, we could gather that you emphasize the fact that the book adds values in terms of creating alternative spectrums for viewing, the victim-perpetrator dichotomy. And you use this within the Banyamulenge soldiers' experience of, helping the RPF to end genocide in Rwanda and also becoming perpetrators themselves in refugee camp in Zaire, and now victims that are being attacked in Eastern Congo. And so this reminds me of the concept of temporality itself, where people are advocating that we should, create alternative temporal frameworks in discussing narratives as suited to different contexts. I think I'm referring to the work of Wes Pavlov, for instance, 2013, called Temporalities, where he argued that the Enlightenment era had defined time, across different geographies following an imperial model. And now it's ill-suited to contexts in the global south, for instance, and because they tend to control the narratives based on what they consider their own timing of events, I think you also spoke about the fact that you militarize local communities, or you militarize local vigilante groups or local ethnic militia, whatever I want to call them. I'm also worried about these terms, does not guarantee safety in these communities. And this, speaks to our own context, even in northeast Nigeria, where you say that you have the Civilian Joint Task Force, who themselves have been victims, have been perpetrators, and have floated in between being absorbed into the Nigerian military and also having splinter factions. Also, some have turned it into like a cash cow of events in the Northeast. So I think it's important to say, how do we manage this local group, especially if you look at the Southwest Nigeria at the moment, people tend to trust these community-driven initiatives of securitization than the formal institutions as created by the state. For multiple reasons, owing to bribery, corruption, inefficiency. In fact, it's been confirmed by some soldiers that they prefer to work with some of these civilian joint task force members than work with the Nigerian police because they tend to understand the terrain and even show more bravery. So how do we manage, this security outfits, within specific context? And I think I'll end with Frank's view on trying to engage with local communities in devising initiative for preventing mass atrocity crimes and even other criminal activities, within, because whatever is not embedded in communities are rarely sustained, beyond the interventions of those who tend to frame them for whatever, purpose. So thank you very much for this. I think I would love to open the floor, but we'll stop recording as we mentioned, or pause the recording as we mentioned earlier, to come so that we'll open up the floor for discussion. But if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat as we'll have Professor Additional type one in the chat, or you raise up your hand to speak and we'll make the platform available. Thank you. Okay, so just to record this last bit of the conversation, I think it's important that we also not be pessimists, when we're talking about these issues, because that's even the reason why we're having this conversation in the first place, to see areas in which we can discuss to move forward, as people and within a different context. So thank you very much for accepting to share your thoughts with us, Professor Davey, and Mr. Osei. We thank you for your expert discussion on the topic. We're grateful to everyone who joined us. Especially, I would love to appreciate Professor Additional, who always joins us for our programs. Professor Byfield is also here, and everyone, the Professor Galkida, and a whole lot of people who are part of the community and those that are joining us for the first time. We appreciate you, and we hope that you be part of our subsequent events. Like it's been shared, the book is available online, and it's good for us to have these kinds of discussions in order to explain, to understand some of these things that happen even outside of our own context and how we have to link them up with them. So I'm wishing you, on behalf of West African Transitional Justice Center, the very best for the rest of the day, wherever you are in the part of the world, and hope to welcome you back to our subsequent events. Thank you very much, and bye for now.
Thank you for a good session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Bye.